The phone in my pocket would not stop vibrating. It started with 47 missed calls on Tuesday, escalated to 63 by Thursday, and by Saturday morning, the number hit exactly 103. Every single buzz sent a tiny wave of satisfaction through my chest. I sat in my new apartment, holding a warm cup of black coffee, watching my old company's digital infrastructure slowly crumble from the outside. 5 days earlier, I had walked out of Vortex Systems with nothing but a cardboard box of personal belongings and a calm smile. My manager, George Highland, had just announced that the senior systems architect promotion, the one I had been working toward for 3 long years, was going to Brandon Finch. Brandon was the office favorite who could not debug a simple database loop, but could charm his way into any executive boardroom. I had stood there, congratulated Brandon with genuine warmth, shook his hand, and even smiled at George. Then I went back to my desk, quietly disabled the automated recovery scripts I had written that kept our servers running, documented absolutely nothing in my final reports, and handed in my resignation effective immediately. Nobody saw it coming, and nobody understood what they had just lost. My name is Daniel Thorne. At 48 years old, I had spent the last 6 years at Vortex Systems. I had climbed from a mid-level engineer to lead systems architect, the person who held the entire back-end infrastructure together with custom code and midnight oil. I grew up in a small town in Ohio where my parents ran a small hardware store. They knew every customer by name and regularly extended store credit to families going through hard times. I watched my father fix a neighbor's lawnmower for free because her husband had recently passed away, and my mother slip extra batteries into bags for families who could not afford them. They never made much money, but they made a difference. That upbringing taught me to see people as human beings first and resources second. I understood what it meant to work twice as hard for half the recognition, and I knew exactly when someone was taking advantage of my good nature. George Highland had been taking advantage of me for years, and he had finally pushed me too far. The morning George announced the promotion started like any other Monday. I arrived at 7:30 in the morning, a full hour before the team, to check on the database logs. Vortex Systems was a mid-sized software company providing customer relationship management solutions to about 800 enterprise clients. Our platform was not flashy, but it was highly reliable. Hospitals used it to manage patient records, banks used it to process transactions, and city governments used it to track public utilities. Server downtime was not just an inconvenience. It meant real, tangible consequences for real people. That reliability was almost entirely my doing. I had designed the current architecture 3 years ago when the old system started buckling. I had written the custom monitoring tools that caught database deadlocks before they became disasters, and I had created the automated recovery scripts that could bring services back online in minutes. I was also responsible for training every new developer who joined our team, explaining the code base and sharing best practices. My annual reviews were always exceptional. George told me repeatedly that I was invaluable, calling me the backbone of the technical team. But when promotion time came, there was always some convenient excuse to wait. They wanted me to wait until next quarter, next fiscal year, or when the next big project wrapped. It was 3 years of next time. Then Brandon Finch joined the company 18 months ago. Brandon was a decent mid-level developer. He could write functional code, and he understood the basics of our technology stack. But he was not exceptional. He was not someone who saw 3 steps ahead, and he certainly could not diagnose a production database issue by instinct. What Brandon excelled at was visibility and corporate politics. He volunteered for every social committee, spoke up in every meeting even when he had nothing of substance to add, and played golf with George on Saturdays. I did not resent his charm, but I resented the assumption that it equaled technical capability. 6 months ago, George created the senior systems architect position. He pulled me aside and said that the role had my name written all over it, asking me to design a roadmap for the 3rd quarter infrastructure upgrade to make it official. I spent the next 4 months designing a complete overhaul of our deployment pipeline, containerization, and zero downtime deployments. I prototyped the entire system on my own time, documented every decision, and presented an implementation plan that would save the company roughly $300,000 annually in operational costs. George loved it. The executive team went wild, and George promised the promotion would be official by the end of the month. That was 6 weeks ago. Now, on this Monday morning, George called an all-hands meeting at 9 in the morning. He stood at the front of the conference room and announced that Brandon Finch would be stepping into the senior systems architect role. The words hit me like ice water, but my expression remained pleasant. After the meeting, George caught my elbow and pulled me into his office. He told me Brandon had the soft skills the role required, and that they needed me right where I was to handle the execution. He was telling me that Brandon would take the credit while I did the work. I looked him in the eye, smiled, and told him that I completely understood. For about 20 minutes after returning to my desk, I sat at my workstation and stared at my dual monitors. My mind was extraordinarily calm. There was no anger, no sadness, and no feeling of betrayal. There was only quiet, precise calculation. I checked my bank account. Living well below my means, I had saved aggressively. Between savings and investments, I had enough to cover 14 months of normal living expenses. If I decided to be frugal, I could stretch that to 18 months. I then checked my email. 3 recruiters had reached out to me in the past month alone. My online professional profile, which I rarely maintained, still received regular inquiries. The job market for someone with my experience in system architecture was exceptionally strong. I knew I would not be unemployed for long. I opened a fresh text file on my computer and began to catalog exactly what I did at Vortex Systems that nobody else on the team knew how to perform. The list grew rapidly. It included the custom monitoring scripts that caught database deadlocks before they could cascade into full systems outages. It included the load balancing algorithms that distributed traffic during peak usage hours, and the automated failover systems that switched to backup databases when the primary ones experienced hiccups. I had also built the caching layer that kept response times under 200 milliseconds and the nightly data reconciliation jobs that caught synchronization errors. None of this was in my official job description. I had built all of it on my own initiative because I saw problems and fixed them. None of these scripts were documented beyond my personal notes. The code itself had comments, but understanding why I had made specific decisions required context that existed primarily in my head. Brandon did not even know these systems existed, and George only had a vague idea that I had automated some tasks. If I walked out, how long would it take for the entire platform to collapse? I checked our incident history. Before I implemented these systems, the company had to deal with an average of about 4 major database outages in a month, and each of those outages lasted between 2 and 6 hours. Customer complaints had been constant, and the previous lead architect had quit in frustration. In the 3 years since I had taken over, we had experienced exactly 2 outages, both related to external service failures, completely outside our control, and both resolved in under 40 minutes. Nobody noticed when things worked perfectly. That was the thankless reality of infrastructure engineering. I made my decision. I opened a new document and typed a short professional resignation letter. It was polite, direct, and stated that my resignation was effective immediately, with 2 weeks of salary forfeited to accommodate the lack of notice. Then, I systematically began to remove my safety nets. I did not delete the scripts. Deleting company property could be classified as sabotage. And I was determined to remain completely within the bounds of the law, specifically avoiding any violation of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act under Title 18, Section 1030 of the United States Code. Instead, I simply disabled them. I modified the scheduled tasks, changing the cron configurations so they would no longer execute. The code remained in the repository, but it would no longer run automatically. Anyone looking at the server logs would only see that the tasks had stopped running. The automated recovery scripts received the same treatment. I then reverted the load balancing configuration files back to the default settings they had when I first joined the company. Finally, I removed the documentation for the 3rd quarter upgrade. I had designed and written those plans on my personal laptop during my own time, meaning Vortex Systems had no legal claim to them under standard intellectual property laws. I moved the files to an encrypted personal archive and deleted them from the company drive. The entire process had taken me about 3 hours to complete, and nobody had interrupted me because they all assumed I was just working on my daily tasks. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the digital infrastructure of Vortex Systems was back in the fragile state it had been in 3 years ago. It was functional, but there were no safety margins left to protect it. The servers would work fine in normal conditions, but the moment a traffic spike or database hiccup occurred, there would be no automated systems to catch it. They would have to identify and fix the problems manually, assuming they could figure out what was wrong. I printed the resignation letter, signed it, and walked to George's office. He was on a phone call, but he waved me in. I waited in silence until he hung up. I handed him the letter. His eyes scanned the paper, and his expression quickly changed from confusion to deep concern, and then to panic. He asked what was going on, and if this was about the promotion. He immediately offered to discuss a salary raise or a title change, but I remained firm. George argued that I could not just leave, with no notice, asking what would happen to the upcoming deployment. I told him that the core systems were documented in the company repositories, and that any competent engineer should be able to maintain them. As for the upgrade, I suggested that Brandon would surely have excellent ideas for moving forward. George's face flushed red, and he accused me of being unprofessional. I reminded him that my employment contract explicitly allowed for immediate resignation if I forfeited 2 weeks of salary, a detail I had already verified with Human Resources earlier that morning. I told him I would pack my desk and be out of the building within the hour. I turned and walked out of his office before he could reply. Packing my desk took less than 30 minutes. I did not have many personal belongings, just a few framed photographs of my family, some programming books, and a coffee mug my parents had given me when I graduated from college. A few of my coworkers stopped by my desk, their eyes wide with surprise at my sudden departure. I gave them all the same polite response, explaining that I had decided to pursue other opportunities and wishing them the absolute best. As I was sealing my box, Brandon Finch walked over. He looked genuinely uncomfortable. He told me he had not asked for the promotion and had no idea I was also in the running. I believed him. Brandon was not a malicious person. He was simply oblivious to how corporate systems worked to his advantage. I congratulated him on the new role, told him I hoped it went well, and walked out of the building. It was exactly 2:15 on Monday afternoon when I drove out of the parking lot, feeling the warm afternoon sun on my face. I slept for 9 hours straight that night, experiencing the deepest rest I had enjoyed in years. The peace was short-lived, however. When I woke up on Tuesday morning, the calls had already begun. The first call came at 8 in the morning from George. I let it go to voicemail. A few minutes later, he called again. Throughout Tuesday, my phone buzzed repeatedly. By the end of the day, I had 47 missed calls from George, from Natalie in Human Resources, and even from our Chief Technology Officer, Walter Jennings. Walter had never spoken to me directly during my 6 years at the company, despite the fact that my work kept his entire department functioning. I did not return a single call. Instead, I spent Wednesday morning updating my resume and updating my online job profiles. I sat at a quiet corner table in a local bakery, sipping tea and eating a warm croissant, enjoying the novel feeling of not having to check server status reports. By Wednesday's afternoon, I had received messages from 3 different recruiters. I sent them my updated resume, noting that I was immediately available for work. One of the recruiters, a professional named Brenda, called me immediately. She was very impressed with my background. That Vortex Systems was well known in the mention that Mornice in the industry for having high system stability, though she now understood why that was the case. She scheduled 2 interviews for me on Monday. By Thursday afternoon, the cumulative number of missed calls on my phone had escalated to 63. George had left several increasingly desperate voicemails, and Natalie had sent 3 emails requesting that I schedule an exit interview to facilitate what she called a standard knowledge transfer. She claimed that our company compliance policy required this before they could process my final paycheck. I laughed when I read that email because I knew my employment contract, which I had reviewed thoroughly, contained no such clause. They had never cared about compliance when they were refusing to document my role or pay me fairly. Now that the system was running without its main architect, they were suddenly desperate for my notes. I deleted her emails and went for a long run in the park, enjoying the autumn air. I did not block their numbers, but I kept my phone on silent, checking the screen only occasionally to watch the numbers rise. On Friday morning, I listened to a voicemail George had left earlier that day. His tone had completely changed from the angry, defensive manager I remembered. He sounded exhausted and panicked. He said the company was experiencing technical difficulties and offered to hire me as an independent contractor at a rate of $200 an hour to help them troubleshoot the issues. He explained that the database connection pool was exhausted and the failover database was not accepting traffic. I knew exactly why that was happening. The database was always undersized, but I had written a custom script that ran every 10 minutes to prune dead connections. With that script disabled, the connections had filled up, locking everyone out. My salary as a full-time employee had worked out to roughly $62 an hour. Now that they were in trouble, my value had suddenly tripled. Walter Jennings had also left a voicemail, his voice deep and demanding. He said they needed to speak urgently about system stability issues and asked me to call him back immediately. Friday evening brought the most telling sign of panic. My phone rang, and the caller identification showed it was coming from my old desk phone at Vortex Systems. Someone was sitting in my chair, using my hardware, desperately searching my workstation files to find a way to fix the servers. I let it ring. A few minutes later, George sent a text message. He begged me to help, stating that multiple clients were down and that people were being affected. He knew I cared about doing the right thing and told me I could name my terms if I would just help them restore the database. I did care about doing the right thing. That was why I had spent 3 years maintaining the systems invisibly. But I also cared about my own self-respect. The outages were not my fault. I had not sabotaged anything. The system was failing because it was poorly designed, and I was no longer there to hide its flaws. I poured myself a glass of wine and ignored the message. By the time I went to bed, the cumulative number of missed calls had reached exactly 103. On Saturday morning, my phone rang at 10 o'clock. It was not George Hyland this time. The screen showed the name of Walter Jennings, the Chief Technology Officer. I decided it was time to answer. I swiped the screen and greeted him politely. Walter was a man who prided himself on executive control, but I could hear the undercurrent of strain in his voice. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He told me that Vortex Systems had experienced major database outages affecting 17 of our largest enterprise clients on Friday. The engineering team had spent the last 18 hours trying to manually recover data and restore client connections. He explained that they had tried to reboot the main application servers, but that had only corrupted the session cache. Furthermore, the nightly synchronization scripts had not run, leaving their backup databases completely out of sync. He asked me if I had sabotaged the database before leaving. I answered calmly, explaining that I had done no such thing. I told him that the core codebase was intact, but that I had disabled my personal monitoring scripts and automated recovery programs when I resigned. I explained that those scripts were not part of my official responsibilities and were never documented in the company repositories. They were my personal tools that I used to make my own job manageable. Without them, the infrastructure had reverted to its default state, which was notoriously unstable. Walter was silent for a moment. He then admitted that he had not understood the extent of my contributions. He told me George had assured him that the technical team was running smoothly under his management, and that he had trusted George's word. This was the closest I would ever get to an apology from the executive leadership of Vortex Systems. Walter then offered to bring me back. He said they would offer me the senior systems architect role immediately, with a 30% raise over my previous salary. I thanked him for the offer but explained that I had already scheduled an interview on Monday morning for a principal systems architect position at another firm. Walter did not hesitate. He countered immediately, offering to match the principal title, increase my salary by 40%, and have me report directly to him instead of George. He also mentioned that Brandon would be transitioned to a project management role where his communication skills would be more appropriate. A week ago, this would have been my dream offer. It was complete vindication. I would have the title, the money, and I would be reporting directly to the chief technology officer. But as I sat there listening to his offer, I realized that nothing had actually changed. They were only offering me this because they were in a desperate situation. I told Walter that I would think about his offer and let him know my decision by Monday morning. On Sunday, I drove to my parents' house in Ohio for our weekly family dinner. The drive was peaceful, and the autumn leaves were beautiful along the highway. My mother had made a pot roast, and my father sat with me on the porch before dinner. He asked how things were going at the office, and I explained that I had resigned. I told him about the promotion going to Brandon, about the subsequent database outages, and about Walter's desperate offer to bring me back with a 40% salary increase. My father listened quietly, nodding slowly as I spoke. He looked out at the street and told me that there was a fundamental difference between being needed and being valued. He explained that people will always need someone competent and reliable when things go wrong, but if they only recognize your worth when you are walking out the door, they do not really value you. They simply do not want to be inconvenienced. He recalled his own experiences at the hardware store, explaining that a business relationship must be built on mutual respect and trust. If an employer treats you like a machine part, they have no right to complain when that part is gone and the machine stops working. His words resonated deeply with me. During dinner, as my mother talked about the hardware store, I reflected on my 6 years at Vortex Systems. I remembered working through the entire winter holidays to patch a critical database vulnerability while George was on vacation, never receiving a single word of appreciation. I remembered training new developers who were subsequently promoted above me because they were considered leadership material. I remembered my suggestions being dismissed in meetings, only to be praised when Brandon repeated them 10 minutes later. It was a pattern of behavior that would not change just because I had a new title and a higher salary. The company culture was broken. They did not value my skills. They simply wanted me to keep the engine running so they could ignore the maintenance. I realized that, if I returned, I would be stepping back into the same environment, and the cycle of exploitation would begin again. By the time I drove home that evening, I had made my decision. I would not go back. On Monday morning, I put on my best professional suit and drove to Summit Technologies. The office was bright and modern, with an open floor plan that felt collaborative rather than chaotic. The engineers I passed in the hallways looked focused but not stressed. My interview was with Audrey Caldwell, the Vice President of Engineering, and Justin Cole, the Director of Infrastructure. They had clearly done their homework on my professional background. Audrey began by telling me that they had been trying to recruit someone of my caliber for 6 months. She mentioned that my work at Vortex Systems was well known in the industry and that they had tracked our public uptime metrics, noting that the platform's reliability had improved from 94% to 99.7% during my tenure. I was surprised and flattered that they had been paying such close attention. We spent the next 2 hours discussing system architecture, technical debt, and scaling strategies. Justin asked me detailed questions about how I designed automated failover systems to prevent database synchronization issues, and I explained my consensus-based health check algorithms. It felt like talking to peers who respected the craft, rather than managers who saw engineering as a black box. Near the end of the interview, Audrey made me a formal offer. The position was Principal Systems Architect. She offered a base salary of $190,000, a 20% annual bonus target, stock options, 4 weeks of paid time off, and the option to work remotely 2 days a week. This represented a 58% increase over my previous salary at Vortex. I asked for until the end of the day to make my decision, and Audrey agreed. I sat in my car in the parking lot and called Walter Jennings. I told him that I appreciated his offer to return to Vortex, but that I had decided to decline. Walter was quiet for a moment, then asked if it was a matter of money. I explained that it was a matter of respect. I told him that I did not want to work in an environment where my contributions were only recognized during a crisis. However, because I did not want the hospitals and city departments that relied on the platform to suffer, I told him where to find my automated scripts. I explained that they were in the repository under a folder named Daniel Thorne Automation. I told him he had my permission to use and modify them. Walter thanked me, admitting that they had failed to recognize what they had. I ended the call and immediately contacted Audrey to accept the position at Summit Technologies. The next 2 years were the most rewarding of my career. I negotiated a start date 3 weeks out, using that time to completely decompress. When I started at Summit, my workstation was set up, and I was welcomed by a team of 8 engineers who were excited to collaborate. Within my first month, we implemented improvements that reduced deployment times by 30%. The work environment was constructive and professional, with a strong emphasis on peer collaboration rather than office politics. 4 months into my tenure, Audrey promoted me to Director of Infrastructure, where I managed a growing team. Today, I am the Vice President of Infrastructure at Summit Technologies, leading 43 engineers across 3 continents. The company went public last year, and the stock options I received allowed me to pay off my student loans and purchase a beautiful home. A few months ago, I ran into Brandon Finch at a technology conference. He told me he had left Vortex shortly after I did. He admitted that the systems had fallen apart for several months until they figured out my scripts, and that George Highland had been reassigned to a different department. Brandon was now working in technical sales at a startup, a role that actually suited his communication skills. He apologized for how things had been handled at Vortex, admitting he had been promoted to a position for which he was unqualified. I shook his hand, harbor no ill will, and wished him luck. On my 2nd anniversary at Summit, my team threw a surprise celebration, presenting me with a cake that read 2 years of not answering their calls. I gave a brief speech, thanking them for their hard work and emphasizing that a leader's job is to ensure that talent is valued, not just needed. I laughed, remembering the 103 missed calls that had started this journey. I had never returned those calls, and I had never regretted that decision. If this story resonates with you, remember that your value does not change based on whether people recognize it. What changes is whether you stay in a place that respects your worth.